Oh, you'd better believe I'm hideously late, and why is that? It's because I'm trying to provide you the best slide content on, as you know, Santa Cruz's #1 Google Slides streaming experience that you can have in Santa Cruz, supporting classics and supporting the university by watching me click through these slides, these really good slides. Hey, so let's go on a trip today. I want to go to Soqotra. It's an island. It's a little island. But what's this? I'm hearing from my spiritual advisors that we cannot go to Soqotra because it is basically 100% of the time covered by nasty clouds, nasty lightning bolt clouds. So the weather prevents us from getting to Soqotra. We're never going to get there. But wait, my spiritual advisors are telling me that as of 1999, there is a full-time airport near the Soqotran capital of Hadibo, which manages daily flights from Yemen, even flights that are subsidized by the Yemeni government. So maybe we can go after all. But I am now hearing from my spiritual advisors that as a consequence of the Yemeni civil war, the United Arab Emirates have taken over the island to drive their tanks around on. So I guess we can't go after all unless we want to take a trip back in time to before 2015, to the period from 1999 to 2015 when you could actually go to this place. And people like to go to this place. Why did people want to go here? Well, there's this kind of attraction that Soqotra has because of its legendary remoteness, the difficulty of getting there. As the first few slides will have suggested, this difficulty of getting to Soqotra, this little bitty island sandwiched between Yemen and Somalia in the Indian Ocean, the difficulty of getting there comes and goes, and it has a lot to do with the disposition of the government that happens to be running the island at any given time. As to whether outsiders can get there or not. Why is it so hard to get to? Well, it is smack dab in the middle of the monsoon, which blows extremely strong there. It's a seasonal wind pattern which, blows in the winter from the Indian subcontinent towards Arabia and Africa, and in the summer it blows the other way. And in Soqotra, essentially all of the time, or like something like 8 to 10 months of the year, the monsoon winds are blowing and make it completely impossible to get there by boat, which was the main way of getting anywhere for most of human history when it came to islands. So the sea's covered with white caps. It's always stormy. You can't go to Soqotra. And people like to go to places that are hard to get to. Those kind of tourists who love climbing Mount Everest, those tourists who take pictures of themselves in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. There's a kind of a tourism that goes with places that are tough to reach, of which Soqotra was one, is again now. It helps a lot if, you're also pretty weird. Look at these plants. They're from Dr. Seuss. And yet, in Soqotra, they are real things. You can see some little goats at the base of the umbrella-shaped tree on the left-hand side of the image. That'll give you a sense of the scale of that thing. It's called the dragon's blood tree, and it bleeds if you cut it. Like, blood-like sap comes out of it. What about those weird bush things on the right? That's Adenium obesum, or the Soqotra rose. It is named for looking like a fat, weird thing. And all the plants there, more or less, they've got a cucumber tree. They've got a ton of very strange fauna growing on Soqotra that grows nowhere else in the world. And this was, in antiquity, to a fairly high degree of certainty, the main reason that people were interested in Soqotra. That Greeks were, especially, and it's their records from antiquity that we have for the most part. Because among the things that you get from Soqotra are the aforementioned dragon's blood, which this anonymous text called the Periplus Maris Erythraei, or the Sail About the Red Sea. It's a sailor's guide that tells you all the cool places to stop along the Red Sea coast on the way to India. So that mentions the Indian cinnabar, which is the dragon's blood tree. We're pretty sure. The author of that text seems to think that the stuff that comes out of it is maybe identical to cinnabar the mercury ore that comes out of the ground. They're both forms of blood that comes from things that are not animals. So a weird and precious substance in the ancient world. And also, the island was much known for its incenses, frankincense, myrrh, various other nards and such grow on Soqotra. Were a major object of trade in antiquity. People went wherever they could find these things because they were consumed on a massive scale in Greco-Roman cult. Every time you do a sacrifice, and even sometimes when you're not doing a sacrifice, you burn some libanos or thus, one of these nice incenses that the gods really like the smell of. And this stuff also comes from Soqotra. So its flora have for a long time been a main point of attraction to tourists, merchants wanting to go to Soqotra. During the recent period of openness, the whole island was declared kind of a conservation area. Parts of it were made more of a conservation area, parts of it kind of less intensely, but that was with respect to the incredible diversity and, from our perspective, weirdness of its plant life. Another thing that has always attracted the attention of passers-by and that also attracted tourists in more recent periods is a group of people who live in the center of the island who are called by many early commentators Aboriginals, people who are thought to be, by Thomas Rowe, for instance, who comes by in the early 17th century, the original inhabitants of the island. The person who took this picture, Douglas Botting, who, as an undergraduate, led an expedition to Soqotra in 1948, describes them similarly. He calls them troglodytes or cave dwellers. He expresses the view that they are the original inhabitants of the island and have lived there basically forever. As we'll see, that's heck of dubious. Even in the Periplus Maris Erythraei, which is this 1st century CE text, which I mentioned before, a guide to sailing around the Red Sea, it's already clear that this is an island that people are moving into. It's an island with a very diverse population. So dwellers are there are dwellers on the island, which are one category that the author of this text mentions, but he also mentions temporary visitors from Arabia and India and Greece, various sailors and merchants, and he says they become epimictoi. That means they stay and mix in with the local population. So even in the case of the Periplus, we're looking at a kind of a population that's always changing, that's diverse, that's in contact with a lot of the rest of the world. This is a legend that gets developed in a very interesting way in the Islamic Middle Ages, the period of time at which Soqotra becomes a little bit better known. One thing that is, say, Aboriginal or very old on Soqotra, even if there isn't necessarily a settled Aboriginal population, is the Soqotri language. The Soqotri language, which is influenced by Arabic, which in urban use is being replaced by Arabic, but still spoken as a first language by most inhabitants of Soqotra. Whether they herd in the kind of the mountains in the middle of the island or live in the cities around the edge of the island. Soqotri is one of a group of languages that are called the modern South Arabian languages. Um, that's not to say that they're modern inventions. That's just to distinguish them from Old South Arabian, which is a different language that's attested in a lot of inscriptions and graffiti. Um, Whereas the modern South Arabian languages don't really have a literate heritage. But they're very different from Arabic. They're different from a lot of the surrounding languages. So they must have broken off as a distinct group a while ago, um, at least a couple thousand years ago. And one of those languages, one of the few that remain, um, is spoken in Soqotra. The others that belong to that group are spoken in Yemen and Oman, and by a diaspora population that's a little more widely distributed. Um, so in the Middle Ages, there becomes this very widespread, legend becomes very widespread in Islamic sources that um, Alexander the Great had populated the island of Socotra with Greek colonists in order to get his hands on the aloes that grow there, which are very good for making laxatives. Aristotle supposedly told him, hey, you want to make laxatives? You can't make them without the aloes that grow on this island, Socotra, so you should settle Greek colonists there. Uh, this legend had a certain degree of plausibility to it for reasons that come out in the passage that's on your screen now. Because the inhabitants of Socotra were Christians from probably a fairly early date, 2nd or 3rd century CE, and well past the point at which the inhabitants of Yemen, the inhabitants of Somalia, all the surrounding areas had converted to Islam. So for a long time, up until actually the 15th, 16th century CE, Socotra remained a Christian island, practicing a kind of an unusual form of Christianity, probably related to St. Thomas Christianity, which is a form of the religion that was practiced in the Indian subcontinent. So in all likelihood, Socotra was probably evangelized from that direction, from India rather than from Greece, but in the Islamic sources, the thought is, well, if an area is Christian, then the Greeks must have gone there. Because Greeks are sort of uniquely susceptible to the Jesusism. An observation from As-Sirafi's present-day situation, the 10th century, when the Greeks are their sort of nearest Christian neighbors. Anyway, so that's yet another theory as to where the population of this island came from. We've seen some theories mooted by the various ancient sources in Greek. And that sets up kind of a problem, a historiographical problem for islands like this, or spaces like this, where there's clearly a long kind of tradition, a long oral tradition, a language that's distinct and that has been spoken there for a long time, as is the case in Socotra, but there's not a written tradition. The result of this situation is that essentially we know the history of these islands or these places. Not all of them are islands, a lot of them are kind of mountainous regions. But we know the history of places like this from the outside. We know it on the basis of outside sources. And as is particularly clear from the stories that Sirafi is spinning, that history is not always accurate. There's some weird stuff in the Periplus, too. The Periplus says that the Socotris, since they can't grow olives, get all their oil from boiling lizards. Anyway, some very, very strange ethnographic material, but this is what happens when, you're not in a position to control your own history, because the literate traditions from sort of outside are writing your history for you. Well, so recently, again during this period of openness in the 2000s, when you could actually get to Soqotra, a discovery was made that did a certain amount to change this situation. And that happened in a cave called Hoq, cave on the northern end of the island. You can sort of, on a good day, you can maybe see Arabia from there. It's just a cave that's above the beach. And this cave turned out to have a lot of really old graffiti in it. Graffiti in a surprising range of languages, covering a range of dates, probably from the 1st century BCE through even the 5th or the 6th century CE, so concentrating in the period that we call late antiquity. Graffiti that comes from not just the Mediterranean. In fact, there's not all that much of it that's in Greek, but all over the Indian Ocean world as well. And that shows that during this period, at least, Soqotra was far from being the kind of distant, isolated place that we think of today. Much more central, kind of at the center of everything, tying together all of these different regions. So, like I said, there are some Greek inscriptions. There's one that's kind of lengthy and that's interesting, and that if you know a little bit of Greek, you can work through the translation of Septimios peniskos naokleros tus theos metakai tu speleu prosekunesa. This is an interesting inscription, not just because it shows that there were in fact Greeks on Soqotra, as the Periplus suggested at this point in time, but also because it reveals something interesting about a few interesting things about what these Greeks were like or where they came from. We can look at the inscription, and from the name of the dude involved, we can infer some things. We have the first part of his name. Most of these inscriptions, people are just writing the first part of their names rather than their whole names. Septi, almost certainly that fills out to Septimios. That means that this person probably lived around the time of the so-called Edict of Caracalla, which in 212 extended Roman citizenship really broadly. So he would have gotten Roman citizenship from Septimius Severus or from Caracalla himself, and therefore taken the nomen Septimios as indicating a patronage relationship with the family, the emperors, the Roman emperors who had given him Roman citizenship, extended the privilege of Roman citizenship. So this person writing in Greek, a Greek language user, is carrying a Roman name, a name that identifies them as belonging to the Roman Empire. But the cognomen that's attached to that, Paniskos, is Egyptian. All of the places where people have encountered that name in inscriptions come from Egypt. So this is an Egyptian writing in Greek, but identifying as a Roman by the nomen Septimios. And this person is a naukleros, probably a ship's captain, and seems to have come into the cave to do some kind of religious worship, prosekunesa, bow down before the gods of the cave. Something that shows up interestingly in a number of these inscriptions is that there seems to be some kind of ritual attachment that people have to this cave. People are not always worshipping Tus Theus in general. That seems to be a particularly kind of like Greek polytheist approach to what's going on in this cave, but you have people who are writing dedications to the Buddha in here. You have people who are writing biblical citations on the walls of walls of the cave. And a lot of incense burners have been found sort of round about. So it seems like some people, although a minority of all the inscriptions we have, did take this cave as a sort of a place of ritual significance. So we have one inscription in Greek. There are a couple of other inscriptions in Greek which are shorter than this. And one very interesting inscription in the Greek alphabet, but not in the Greek language. It is in Bactrian, an Indic language that is written with the Greek alphabet, and that corresponds to kind of modern Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan. Bactria. Would love to ask if anyone knows what is Bactria. Bactria is where the Bactrian camel gets its name, but it's also the furthest extent to the east of Alexander the Great's conquests. So Bactria was an independent Greek kingdom in Afghanistan and Pakistan for a little while after Alexander the Great's death. Eventually parts of it fell to the Seleucids. Other parts were taken over by Indic populations, not the Greeks, but they kept the Greek alphabet. There's a lot of Greek influence on the art of Bactria. There's a kind of an Indo-Greek style that emerges there. It's a really interesting an area of the world to study. And there's quite a lot of inscriptional evidence that a person can look at, and coins even, to explore that further. So at the point when this text was written, which is probably like 3rd century CE, the Bactrian kingdom has been gone for a while, but there's this successor state, the Kushan kingdom, in the same area, which keeps a lot of the Greek heritage and again keeps the Greek alphabet. So we've got somebody from that zone of India writing their name here in Greek letters, but the name itself is Bactrian. It's actually Iranian in derivation. Humaya or Humayak. It means the person who's got good magic powers, person possessed of a good maya. This person of Iranian descent, somebody who is bringing reminders to this island of Soqotra of events that happened in sort of classical history hundreds of years before. Events in ancient history tend to have kind of long tails like that. And that's not the only one to speak of here. We also have some fun inscriptions in an alphabet called Brahmi, which I'm going to talk about in detail in a minute, where people self-identify. They're writing in Sanskrit or a Middle Indic language, but they self-identify as a Shaka. A Shaka is the self-designation for the people that Herodotus calls Scythians. People who speak an Iranian language, people who live in what is now Russia and have various encounters with kingdoms and city-states in the Near East. There's a period when they kind of roll through there and conquer everything. Some of them settle down in northern India and create a kind of a combination Scythian, Persian, Indic empire in northern India. So you end up also, here's a map of the area that I'm talking about here. The green part is the sort of heartland of that empire, and its influence extends down into the yellow zones as well. That little town down there that's called Barigaza in this illustration is an important one for the Soqotran inscriptions because it's the place where people most frequently self-identify as coming from. If the people who do the graffiti say where I'm from, they'll say, "Oh, I'm from Barakocha is the Indic name. It's now Broach, but Baragadza is the Greek name for it. That's where they say that they're from in most cases." So you also end up with people in the structure of this kingdom self-identifying as satraps, which is a blast from the past. Satrap is not really an office that's existed since the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, but it sort of recurs in this Scythian Empire in northern India, and it shows up in these inscriptions. Satrap in this cultural context is almost a caste. It identifies you as belonging to the Kshatriya caste, and particularly and noble ruling families of the Shaka Empire in that caste. So these inscriptions, like the Bactrian inscription, still recall the world of the Scythians, recall this earlier world of the Achaemenid Empire, of Persian culture and political structures, but they're written in, as I said, a language called Brahmi. This is a language that has a lot of epigraphic variation over time. We've got a kind of a stereotyped alphabet there. It does eventually give rise, at a much later period, we're talking the late Middle Ages, to the script that you would probably the scripts that you would recognize as recording Indian languages today, the so-called Devanagari scripts with the very distinctive straight bar across the top connecting all the characters. You can see that development sort of starting to happen in the graffiti that's on your screen there. There's what's called a headline or a serif on top of a lot of the letters. But it will be a good hundreds of years before that the continuous headline is standardized for this script. So the script also gives rise to a whole bunch of other scripts in the region, in Southeast Asia, in Tibet. Tibetan script is based on the Brahmi alphabet. Tocharian script. I do hope to give a little talk about the Tocharians one of these days as well. But this Brahmi script is what's used to record basically all Indic languages, with the exception of what will eventually sort of shake out as Punjabi, which has a different script called Gurmukhi or Kharoshti, which is also represented surprisingly in a couple of inscriptions in the Hoq cave. Almost all of the ones that are in Indic languages are in Brahmi, but there are some outliers like the Homayak inscription we looked at a moment ago, and the Kharoshti inscription just mentioned. So the particular form of Brahmi which is being used here has been traced by paleographers doing extremely painstaking letter-by-letter comparisons to the region of Gujarat, which is, again, right about where that little town called Baragadza is. So on the southern edge of the influence of the Shaka, the zone of influence of the Scythian kingdom in northern India. And it is also, not coincidentally, the area where there's probably one of the couple of areas where there's the most evidence for Indo-Roman, Indo-Greek interactions in the 2nd, 3rd century CE. The trade gets started in the 1st century CE with the discovery of the monsoon winds by Greek and Roman navigators. They use these winds to make the trip to India a lot faster, and eventually to make the trip back a lot faster. And it really blows up over the 2nd and 3rd and then maybe even 4th century CE. But it does peter out in very late antiquity in the 5th and 6th centuries. And when this trade is going on, one of the big stops is Baragadza, or Broach, modern Broach, which is in the region where the Brahmi script that a lot of these graffitis are written in seems to originate. So we've so far seen inscriptions, graffiti on the wall of this cave that traces to Greece. We've seen graffiti that traces to India, and I should say that by far the majority of graffiti in the cave is in Brahmi and records Sanskrit or Middle Indic languages. The people who are making those inscriptions come from a variety of cultural and religious backgrounds within the Gujarati context. There are Vaishnava proto-Hindus, there are possibly Jainists, definitely a lot of Buddhists putting up inscriptions. And this is something that we can tell on the basis of the names of the people who are writing the graffiti. Names are an index of community belonging and often of religious belonging. But it's not just Scythian, it's not just Indian Brahmi, it's not just Greek that are being written on these cave walls. And this is where it gets kind of wild. Somebody put a big old tablet with a bunch of palmyrene in the cave. This is a tablet that, like the Greek inscription, seems to regard the cave as a kind of a ritual setting or a holy place with gods of its own. Palmyra is a town at the very north of Arabia, and it is not close to the ocean. So the writer of this text must have traveled a long, distant road to get to Soqotra. Some mystery involved in figuring out how that would even have happened. Palmyra is involved in trade all over the Mediterranean. It's also involved in riverine trade down the Tigris and the Euphrates. So that would have connected possibly this merchant to the Indian Ocean. They brought the wood with them because there is not good wood on Soqotra. Remember what I said about all the trees being kind of bonkers? Well, one consequence of that is that they do not make very good wood to build things with. Or certainly a kind of a polished hardwood like this, which can last in a cave for 1800 years. It's pretty amazing. Even the ink is still legible. It's quite clearly legible. We get this testimony that somebody came to the cave in pain of their soul, the pain of their spirit, hoping to get maybe a little bit of relief from the god of the cave. And there's a blessing for those who leave the tablet in place as well. So that traces a really kind of long and difficult connection between Palmyra and Soqotra. Two places separated by the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula, not connected by water. There are a lot of graffitis from more nearby regions. So you get a lot of interesting graffiti from South Arabia. Yemen and South Arabia have always sort of been politically closely associated with Soqotra, not necessarily ruling it, although often claiming to rule it. Certainly very close geographically, so there are a number of graffiti from South Arabian writers recording messages that in some cases we can decipher. South Arabian is a vowelless script, so there is a lot of hard, thinky work that goes into figuring out how to reconstruct any particular inscription in it. The other thing is that it's not always written in one direction or the other. And the third thing is that it looks exactly like the script used to record Ethiopic Aksumite. So a language from Africa. It's quite distinctive in terms of how it works as a language. It's related to South Arabian, but not all that closely. So you even have to figure out when you're looking at graffiti like this, well, what language is it in? And that matters for how you read it because the Aksumite script is always read from left to right, whereas you get some variation with the South Arabian. So these are a couple of, again, graffiti that gesture toward the ritual or numinous character of the cave. The reconstruction of the South Arabian is a little bit speculative. Abdessia came and you hid yourself. It's the best that the epigrapher has been able to make of it. But it seems to suggest that there is a god or a spirit in the cave who is supposed to appear but did not when Abdessia visited. So he was a bit disappointed and wrote this bad Yelp review. The Aksumite inscription seems to acknowledge the numinous character of the cave in a different way. By writing what appears to be a partial quote from the Beatitudes, as recorded in Matthew and Luke, on the wall of the cave. Sehuf Bedor. Now this is difficult to decipher as well because, like Old South Arabian, Aksumite is vowelless, but this is kind of a tag that Aksumite writers put up elsewhere, not just on Soqotra. So one's on fairly good ground saying that this is a biblical citation that is going on the wall and asking for even a blessing for the writer of the inscription. So there's all kinds of people coming from basically everywhere on Soqotra. And that raises the question of what is in the end going on here? What's going on here? The island is not, despite the difficulty of reaching it, which is real, the monsoon winds are always an obstacle. Despite that difficulty, the island is not apparently remote in this period. It might be better described as a kind of a refuge at the heart of everything, a refuge that is accessible if you need to get there. And when I say that, I'm thinking of a theory that a guy named James Scott developed in a book that's going to be in the bibliography here, called The Art of Not Being Governed, where he said that in a lot of parts of the world, peoples who are regarded as being aboriginal, as being without history, in fact have a very complex history because they are kind of combinations of people who fled from areas that are being governed. So if you're being governed or ruled in a way that you don't really like, one way to get away from that is to just flee. Go somewhere else. Leave the territory of the government that is, in your view, mistreating you. So this was a lot easier to do before the world was sort of universally divided up into countries as it is now. You cannot flee from a government in that way, but anymore. But certainly as recently as the 19th century, this was something that's possible to do. James Scott's examples come from the highland or mountainous regions of Southeast Asia, in South China and North Vietnam, where various people like the Hakka and the Hmong have long resisted national sort of encompassment by occupying these areas that are difficult to reach, that are difficult to govern because of their mountainous character. Often in those areas there are traces of multiple waves of in-migration. The populations are culturally mixed. And that's definitely true of Soqotra as well. From the very earliest testimonies that we have about it, it seems like Soqotra is a place where people go and where they don't have to be governed. Certainly Soqotra has a record of not being particularly governable by the methods of the nation state. The British found this out, the Yemeni found this out. The only time, really, when it seems like Soqotra has been governed in some kind of a regular way was the period up through about 1967, beginning in the 19th century, when a sultan lived on the island and from there governed a chunk of Yemen. Soqotra is not really a place that responds well to power structures being imposed from the outside, because it is difficult to reach, because also it's quite mountainous in the interior. So its remoteness is something that maybe has always been kind of attractive to people. But its remoteness is at the same time sort of the flip side of its centrality. Soqotra is at the center of multiple trade routes. It's between multiple empires, between multiple civilizations. Central but remote. It's an island version of these kind of refuges from being governed that James Scott is talking about. So there is the bibliography. There's Scott, a few other books that are sort of interesting on this topic. I would want to put in a plug here for writing your congressman, getting them to support any measures getting the U.S. to disengage with the civil war in Yemen, getting them to stop supporting the Saudis and the Emiratis, who are sort of starving Yemen to death. And if you don't care about the people, they've also blown up quite a lot of Yemen's classical heritage, something that you don't hear much about because the Saudis are our allies, but they've been probably about as destructive as ISIS in terms of destroying the old stuff in Yemen, of which there was once quite a lot. Now it's largely reduced to dust. Soqotra has actually been lucky in a sense, because being remote or selectively remote in the way that it is, the conflict hasn't really come there except for the aforementioned UAE occupation of the island. It's very hard to tell what's going on with that because information doesn't really get in or out of Soqotra as easily as it used to. But do write your congressman. The U.S. has a lot of responsibility for the civil war in Yemen, and we can do something to bring it to an end. Okay, well, I've run a bit over. I don't think that I even have time at this point to put my cat on screen, because I don't know where my cat is. I'm in the house somewhere, I'm sure. I do want to say that one theme of these horrible little lectures is that once you get outside of Greece and Rome, there's still a lot of really interesting stuff going on in the classical world, which is bigger than Greece and Rome, is bigger even than the Mediterranean. And in a lot of those places, there's a lot of research that remains to be done. Greece and Rome are in some ways worked over territory. You can still discover stuff there, it's just a little more difficult, but if you are interested in pursuing classics professionally and you want to do something really new, why not look at a place like Nubia, to recall the very first of these awful lectures, or Soqotra, places where basic scholarship still remains to be done. And I'll tell you, the work that has been done on the Greek inscriptions from Soqotra is just dog vomit. So you could replace that with something better, I think, even just working over the summer on the basic problems of the epigraphy. Well, let that be my invitation to you, and I invite you now to tune out, because I'm going away. So have a good rest of your night.